Welcome everybody to this annual Drapers Lecture. I'm really delighted to be welcoming you this year to the Drapers Theatre as well, which I think is a really apposite place for us to be holding this lecture. I also want to welcome Nick Hillman, and I think most of you will know him from one guise or another, and I'll just run through some of those guises in a moment. And in fact, somebody did say to me, I know that name, where do I know that name from? So I actually ran through a number of things before, but perhaps you recognize him because he was a postgraduate here in the School of History. Perhaps from his days as Chief of Staff or Special Advisor to David Willits, now Lord Willits, when David was the Minister of State for Universities and Science, which is, I think, when I first met Nick, or currently as the Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute, or HEPI. And I did actually flash this to a few people as well, in terms of, surely you've seen these pamphlets about the place on all sorts of topical issues, this one being Where Next for Widening Participation and Fair Access, something that we're very concerned about here at Queen Mary. I should also say, in 2016, Nick was made a Fellow of this university as well, and we might want to come back to that later. I have to say a few words about Nick from my experience of working with him. He's always been exceptionally keen to collaborate, research, and make sure he underpins any of his policy publications and interventions with absolutely solid data. And you're probably aware that Nick played a significant role in the heated debate around the value of international students to the UK HE system and more broadly to the economy. I think due to your relentless drive and your very great, robust and rigorous publications quantifying the benefits, both hard and soft, of international students, the government did suggest a relaxation of the rules to allow post-study work visas for 2 years now for our international students. I know Nick best through collaborating with him when I worked at the Higher Education Academy on the Student Academic Experience Survey. I don't know how many of you read it. I mean, I used to read it avidly because it was wonderful pointers for things that we should be concerned about in higher education. It first ran in 2006. It was an annual survey. It was cited by certainly David Willits. It was before even Nick was at HEPI. It was cited by Joe Johnson. Annually now, it attracts about 14,000 students per annum to that survey, which is, I reckon, about 0.8% of the student population, which isn't bad in terms of an annual survey seeking views of students. It's become somewhat of a handbook for the sector, and of course the big issue that's raised every year is that issue of value for money. And every year, unsurprisingly, the similar thing, right, what exactly do you think constitutes value? And teaching is right up there. Where would you like to see more money being spent on training of our teaching staff? So I think to read that and to look at the trend data, obviously there are certain things that we're not doing well enough on, that being one. The other one, of course, that we're still working on is well-being, and Nick has an embargoed publication coming out on Thursday, which I think looks to be a really very useful read, once again on well-being and the drilling down further to the data coming out of that particular survey. So I think in summary, particularly all that trend data, that wonderful track record, that evidence base that I think we all feel without the evidence base we can't make decisions. Who better to talk to us about the future of higher education, particularly looking through the student lens. So please join me in welcoming Nick Hillman now to deliver this year's Drapers Lecture. Thank you very much,
Stephanie.
Nick.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm just going to put a timer on because I've got so much material. I don't want to overrun, and I want people to have a chance to ask questions. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight to you. That's the name of my organisation, the Higher Education Policy Institute. It's a great pleasure to be asked to come and deliver this speech. I know you've had some very grand people deliver it in the past. Chris Husbands, who's incidentally written one of our forthcoming reports, to name but one, Vice-Chancellor of Hallam University. And it's a great pleasure to be at an event sponsored by a livery company as well. We're very lucky in the UK to have so many livery companies, including livery companies that give good slugs of money to education. And I know that because my first job after my undergraduate degree, before coming here as a postgraduate, was to be a teacher in a secondary school sponsored by a different livery company, I'm sorry to say. But nonetheless, it did give me an understanding of how important the support of livery companies is. And so I thank the Drapers Company for its support for tonight, and indeed for all its support going right back to Victorian times for this great institution. Queen Mary fills a very special place in British higher education. Universities have many roles, and every Vice-Chancellor I meet tells me that their university is a fabulous local, national and international institution. But it's almost never true in practice, because it's incredibly hard to do all three roles really well. But here at Queen Mary, I think you do get as close as is probably humanly possible to the rare feat of excelling locally, nationally and internationally. You've got those deep roots in the East End of London, represented for me by the tranquil Jewish cemetery in the middle of this campus. You've got a national role as one of our great research-intensive universities, with one of the world's great teaching hospitals in Barts, and is now a member of the Russell Group. And you bridge international boundaries through your research and by the incredibly high number of nationalities represented here on campus. And thanks, Tony. Queen Mary fills a very special place in my own heart. There is, I am graduating in 1999. I was a postgraduate student here on a Toastmasters course, The Nexus Between Politics and History, in 1988 to 1999. I was originally attracted to Queen Mary by the indefatigable Professor Peter Hennessy and his great books about British politics. And although I was drawn here by one of your star signings, when I arrived I found there was also strength in breadth and depth across the history department. And I particularly enjoyed learning from people like Dr. Cattrall and James Ellison. And we weren't just desk-bound either. We were taken on private visits to wonderful places like number 10 Downing Street, the National Archives, to bits of the British Library that hadn't yet even been opened. And we were lucky enough to have seminars in Parliament with Tony Benn, in the Cabinet Office with Richard Wilson, who was the Cabinet Secretary at the time, and here at QM, or QMW as we called it in those days, with the Private Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. We were sworn to secrecy about our last one. We were told we mustn't tell anyone we were having a seminar with the Private Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. But I'm working on the assumption that I'm working on the sort of 20-year rule assumption that if it happened more than 20 years ago, it's okay to mention it. And for me, the highlight, though, here at Queen Mary was actually learning from this man, Professor John Ramsden, who was perhaps the greatest of all historians of the Conservative Party. And although the Conservative Party is sometimes described as the most successful political party in the Western world, and they currently look quite powerful once again, having increased their vote at each of the last 6 general elections and coming first in the last 4, back in 1998 to 1999, people were wondering whether they would ever get back into power. And it was a particularly interesting time to be learning from John Ramsden. He was a fantastic researcher and a wonderful teacher, and actually a practitioner of politics as well as leader of Redbridge Council in the 1980s. And that really, he brought that to his work. And I remember he marked an essay of mine once where I had erroneously claimed that Ted Heath had lost power in the spring. And he wrote on my essay, "As one who canvassed throughout February 1974 on people's doorsteps, I assure you it was not spring." And John's interest went far beyond politics and history to drama, film, popular culture. And he was someone who didn't need to be under the cosh of the Teaching Excellence Framework to care passionately about his interests, the interests and progress of his students. He helped me get my first academic paper published, and he helped me get my first job in policy working for David Willetts 20 years ago. It was a tragedy that he died so soon after his retirement, though it's wonderful to see the sort of work that he was famous for here at Queen Mary being carried on in the output of today's academics here, such as Professor Tim Bale. And as a student here, I benefited not only from the academic experience, I also found opportunities to hone my writing in the pages of Cub, the student newspaper, to learn more about social mobility and university access issues by helping at the Central Foundation Girls' School just down the road from here, and to learn more about higher education policy by representing QM at the National Union of Students Conference in 1999, which was the first one after the reintroduction of tuition fees, back then only £1,000 a year. It may have been 20 years ago, but the arguments swirling around were very similar. And I do sometimes think in my job that there's no such thing as a genuinely new education policy question, even though the evidence and the answers sometimes change. And all of these formative experiences here at Queen Mary are highly relevant to my role today. So I benefited enormously from my time here, as did some of my all of my fellow cohort of students, and those of whom, many of whom are in the photo there, I'm still in contact with, are working at senior levels in education, both in universities and schools, in the city, in the BBC. And when I mentioned to a senior higher education figure that I was coming here to deliver this lecture, he said to me that Queen Mary is special to him because it's where social mobility and employability come together to create something new. And that was certainly true for me and my cohort of students. After leaving Queen Mary, I spent time working in Westminster as a parliamentary researcher, in the city as a policy advisor for insurance companies, and in Whitehall, as Stephanie kindly said, as a special advisor to the Minister for Universities and Science, David Willetts, during the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. And the last of these three roles meant I had a ringside seat during the tripling of tuition fees in the 2010 to 2012 period. And when I received an honorary fellowship here at Queen Mary in 2016, your then Chair of Council, Sir Nick Montague, took great pleasure in telling all the graduating students about my role in raising their fees. And if they hadn't had the restraining influence of their parents sitting next to them, I'm really not sure I would have got out of there alive. But I continue to think the changes we made back then in that period were along the right lines. No one likes it when the cost of something they wish to purchase triples in price. But the changes allowed universities to be properly funded during tough years of austerity, and thanks to the income contingent student loan repayment terms, without putting undue pressure on graduates or students. And many people opposed what we did, and they continue to do so. It's my favourite slogan on a poster on the left-hand side there. They say that we marketised, commodified and Americanised our higher education sector. But I remember leaving the UK when those protests were happening and going to California and talking to some students there. The progressive students in California at the time were lobbying for a student funding model that looked remarkably similar to the one that people were protesting about here. And because it was so much more progressive than the one they had and indeed continue to have. I'd also point out that the scheme that we implemented allowed additional support to be made available to postgraduate students. And as we hope to show in a report we'll be publishing in a month or two's time, our postgraduate students are very gradually becoming more diverse, and it's long overdue. But the best feature, thank you, of the funding system by far, in my view, and many of you may disagree with this, is the freedom that it allowed to remove undergraduate student number controls, which is a story that we've told in various HEPI reports, and there's a recent article in The Guardian that takes a very different point of view. I know some people say it differently, but in my view, it's only by liberalising the supply of places that you can deliver true widening participation. Otherwise, potential students are in a zero-sum game in which those with the most social capital and the better schooling and the fewest disadvantages will always tend to win. Before the removal of student number controls, we had willing students knocking on the doors of universities that wanted to take them, but whom were being shut out of higher education because the institutions couldn't afford the fines they would have been charged if they had over-recruited on their target numbers. And since the removal of student number controls, we've seen a higher proportion of school leavers making it to higher education, including to their first choice course and university. And admittedly, institutions have been falling over themselves in sometimes unedifying ways to recruit as many students as they can. But given the freeing up of spaces in the end of the zero-sum game, it's no coincidence that contextual offers have moved in recent years from being something that was so controversial, it was often on the front pages of our newspapers, to something that now seems entirely unremarkable or even the norm. Sorry, slip on one more. Thank you. And as I explained in the Times Higher just before Christmas, there are lots of reasons to think student number caps could be on their way back, just as has already happened in Australia. And as we showed in a recent report written by Lee Elliott Major, who is the UK's first Professor of Social Mobility, and his colleague at Exeter, Pallavi Amitva Banerjee, if student numbers are artificially held down in the face of Office for Students' ambitious access targets, we could soon revert to the status quo ante with fierce battles for the available places. And one reason why that could be so challenging is the extra demand that is about to arise as a result of the coming increase in the number of 18-year-olds, as well as continued growth in the proportion of school leavers who want to go to higher education and better outcomes in schools, particularly here in London, of course. HEPI, we've calculated that we need another 300,000 higher education places by 2030. And in fact, that is only the number of full-time places needed in England. It's a conservative calculation too, because as the slide shows, if we were to assume, for example, that young men were to start entering higher education in the same proportion as young women, we would actually need closer to 500,000 places. So demand could be a lot higher than the 300,000 places that I've mentioned. And I have in the past called for a new higher education participation target of 70% so that we can properly prepare for the extra demand. Though the idea got me some classy abuse online when I suggested it. And these are the sort of big numbers that policymakers, especially in the Treasury, have sleepless nights over. Particularly now the 45p in every pound loaned out to students, the 45p in every pound that's loaned out to a student that is written off is going to start appearing in the national accounts that add to the public spending figures, which add billions overnight to the annual deficit which the politicians say they want to be judged on. You will recall that 3 years ago, just as the 2017 cohort of undergraduate students were starting their degrees, Theresa May, as Prime Minister, announced a review of post-18 education and funding, into which a panel led by an independent banker called Philip Auger was to feed their views. And that panel reported last May, their report is up on the screen, and among other things, they recommended a cut in the tuition fee cap for full-time undergraduates in England to 7,500. We now expect for the government to respond to that report in the summer at the time of the spending review. And incredibly, this means that those students who were just matriculating in 2017 when the report was being when the review was being officially launched, may well have graduated before we know what the government thinks of the funding system we currently have. And two other quick points about the Auger report. Their report had a lot to say about boosting further education, and there is a pretty clear consensus that this now needs to happen. And those of us in higher education, I think, need to explain more clearly than maybe we have done to policymakers why the undoubted need to boost FE should not come at the expense of HE. And I'm with Bob Kerslake, a member of the House of Lords and the former head of the Home Civil Service, on this, who told his fellow peers in the House of Lords, Auger will have done us a great disservice if it creates a false dichotomy between FE and HE. There is no great nobility in austerity that should compel us to transfer funding from one part of the sector to the other. Thank you. Moreover, we need to recall that the best case scenario in Auger, even assuming the Treasury makes up any cut in tuition fees, as they recommend, is an 11% drop in the amount of funding universities get to educate each student between 2018 and 2022. So to thrive, we're going to need to be much more efficient as a sector, or recruit many more full fee-paying international students to cross-subsidise other activity, or just simply spend less on some things we currently do. And I do worry that could mean less civic engagement, less outreach, less working with schools, less course choice, less support for students, and even less teaching. Thank you. Beyond the issues of fees and funding and student numbers, I think the priority should be living cost support for students. I have always opposed the removal of student maintenance grants in England. It was a bad idea when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did it in the late 1990s, and it was which they then reversed, and it was a bad idea when David Cameron and George Osborne repeated the trick in 2016. My concern is less to do with the behavioural impact, although it is possible that the absence of maintenance grants is partly to blame for the recent modest increase in dropout rates among undergraduates. My concern is more a moral one, because I think quite simply it's wrong to expect the poorest students to emerge from university with the biggest debts. Whatever happens, to me the most important thing is that we maintain the removal of student number caps for the reasons I've already outlined on widening participation. And so to me, almost any tweak to the fees and funding regime is worth doing if it means protecting the demand-driven system, because it gives students more choice, allows institutions to reach their natural size, and encourages social mobility. And then any other approach where student numbers are clamped down upon again flies in the face of the 97% of mothers of young children who want their child to go to university. And it also ignores the fact that rising life expectancy mean people can spend longer in education, while their education still makes up a smaller proportion of their lives than it did for people in the past. Clamping down on the growth in student places would hinder social mobility, as we will soon suggest in a paper on the end of the demand-driven system in Australia. Thank you. My support for maintaining the absence of student number controls does not mean, by the way, that I think higher education is right for everyone, nor do I think people should be free to enrol at university to do absolutely anything. The new government was elected on a manifesto commitment that you can see on the screen to crack down on what they call low-quality courses. That may not be a popular idea with staff or students, but it is reasonable for policymakers, in my view, to ask whether taxpayers are getting good value for their public investment in higher education. The problem, of course, is that no one is absolutely certain how to measure value. There are lots of potential ways to do it, and some of them are shown on the left of this slide. And there are many proxies for measuring value, but they are all deeply flawed, as the right of this slide also shows. But I think this slide is also a challenge to all of us working in higher education, and perhaps especially those of us working in higher education policy. If the government insists on measuring value in our sector, and we as a sector fail to help them do that, things may end up being done to us that we will not enjoy using data that we do not recognise. And I'm pleased to say the serious work on value is now happening inside Universities UK, and we will ourselves be holding an expert policy seminar on the event here in London in a few weeks' time. And I want to move on now to say something about international students, because all three of our biggest reports during my time at HEPI have been on international students, produced in conjunction with Kaplan and London Economics. And it's one part of the higher education system where there truly is a global market and global competition. There are very good reasons why students from across the world want to come and study in the UK, such as the prestige of our universities, the English language, and the fact that, as Elsevier's work for the government shows, we're strong across the whole range of disciplines, which is very unusual for a country of our size, although you know that, of course, here at Queen Mary better than most. And the benefits of hosting so many international students in the UK are immense. They include more diverse campuses. People like learning alongside people from other countries. More soft power. We do an annual count of how many world leaders were educated in the UK. And more, of course, hard cash. But other English-speaking countries have been gaining on our position. Countries like China are increasingly receivers as well as emitters of international students, as we showed in our 2017 HEPI annual lecture. And the recent ups and downs in geopolitics mean we are very exposed to world events. So while I welcome the government's target in their international education strategy to increase the number of international students here in the UK to 600,000 by 2030, it is notable that past such targets have been missed, and the Home Office retains control over the finer points of migration policy and remains no friend to our sector. While institutions can put even more effort into recruiting international students, especially if there's a better set of migration rules, success is neither guaranteed nor wholly in the sector's own hands. I also don't plan to say masses about Brexit tonight, because nearly 4 years on from the referendum, and after we have officially left the EU, we still have very little idea what it's likely to mean for our sector. What fees will EU students face? Will we be in Erasmus+? Will we still be a key player in European research programmes? We don't yet know. We have published a HEPI, the most detailed economic modelling on what might happen to student demand for UK HE from the EU after Brexit. This suggested a 57% decline in incoming students from other EU countries, but also an increase in fee income, because everybody who does come here, including any extra international students attracted by the reduction in the value of the pound since referendum day, would be paying the full international fees. Nonetheless, thank you. As one Vice-Chancellor said to me, the assumptions in our modelling are heroic. And anyway, there is at least one historic precedent when Margaret Thatcher got rid of fee subsidies for non-EEC students in the 1980s that suggests the opposite could happen. In other words, universities might work harder to chase down EU students if they can charge them the full economic cost and more, as we explained in a report last summer. On the other hand, the EU may try and insist on continued access to our higher education institutions at preferential fee rates as part of the coming trade negotiations. And who knows, maybe large countries outside the EU will look for similar arrangements as part of their own trade deals. Just in the past week, I've heard the Vice-Chancellor of one of our larger institutions say he could well imagine civil servants signing away lower fees in the latter stages of a late-night trade deal with India. So instead of dwelling for too long on international students or Brexit, I want to turn instead to two other important areas before I end: students of the future and research. If we are to continue expanding student places for home students, as I have made clear I hope we do, then students will continue to look more different to students in the past. There will be more first and family students, more students with multiple indicators of disadvantage, and probably more students looking to stay closer to home. At least that's the received wisdom. In a book launched just a few days ago called The University Challenge, written by Ed Byrne, the president of King's College London, and Charles Clarke, the former Secretary of State for Education, they write the only prediction, it's a 250-page book, and they say the only prediction that we feel able to make with any confidence is that over the next couple of decades, there will be a declining proportion of students getting their undergraduate degrees through the traditional route of a residential 3-year degree living away from home. There hasn't actually been the story in recent decades during which the proportion of students who live at home has stayed at around 20% here. But if Byrne and Clarke are right, or even if they're only just half right, then universities will not be able to expect their students to change their identities to fit in with how things have always worked. They will need to meet the changing backgrounds of students halfway. And in recent years at HEPI, sorry, go back one, Janet, if you don't mind, thank you. In recent years at HEPI, we've published reports on the dominance of the residential model of higher education, which is quite unusual globally, but is dominant here. And I call it the boarding school model of higher education. And also on the extra challenges faced by other types of students, commuter students. Currently, commuter students have poorer outcomes than those who move away from home, and they're less engaged and less satisfied with their academic experiences. Though it's not always clear whether this is because they're commuter students or if it's because of the factors that make them be commuter students that are hindering their learning. Unlike many of your fellow Russell Group universities, you already know a lot about commuter students, and you know it is no good expecting new types of students to engage in exactly the same ways as more traditional students. And on this, some of your competitor universities may need to change to become a little more like you. One of the biggest changes in recent years has been the decline in part-time students. The decline is so dramatic. This is one area where almost everyone accepts the current funding model is just not working. The decline matters for many reasons, but I shall mention only one. If fewer migrants are to come to the UK after Brexit, then it is even more important that we raise the skills of adults already in the country if we are to maintain our economic success. Thank you. While the decline in part-time students is well known, some people seem to have become desensitised to the numbers. That is why our newest report that came out just last Thursday is a qualitative study that captures the voices of part-time learners. It covers the anxieties the part-time students face about returning to education and the stresses they experience while studying, but also the new opportunities that can be unlocked by returning to study. Some people think the changes to the labour market may automatically bring the part-time sector back, as employers and employees reconcile themselves even more to the pace of change in the modern world, as well as to new working patterns. So they will, it is said, look for more retraining and upskilling opportunities. But the barriers, real or perceived, felt by many potential part-time learners mean it is unlikely to happen without some pretty hefty new policy interventions. High fees with loan-based financing and tough eligibility rules may work well for full-time students fresh out of school, but they don't work well for adult learners with existing caring and financial responsibilities who want to dip their toes back in the water. The qualitative research shows that when you meet a young full-time student and ask them what they do, they tell you they are a student. When you meet a part-time student and ask them what they do, they tend to tell you they are a parent, a carer, or who they work for. In other words, their self-perceptions and their relationships to learning are very different. Thank you. When it comes to finance for part-time students, I tend to agree with the economist Lionel Robbins. Although the Robbins report of 1963, which set in train the big expansion of UK higher education, was not about student finance, he later made it clear that he did favour student loans in principle, but not where higher education needed fostering by grants, even at the cost of some infringement of the abstract principles of ideal public finance. And I think perhaps that's a good explanation of where we are in the part-time debate. There are many people who will tell you that universities will look physically different too in the future, with fewer, if any, lecture halls and much more online learning. Perhaps. Indeed, it is already happening in some places, as on the University of Northampton's new Smart Campus, which has only one lecture hall. But I admit to some scepticism about some of the wilder forecasts. As Derek Bock recalls in his excellent book, Universities in the Marketplace, The Commercialisation of Higher Education. Sorry, can you move on one more? Sorry, thank you. Back one, where I got out of sync. Back one. Sorry, this one, the two out of order. Thomas Edison said back in the 1920s that motion pictures would replace campus lectures. The invention of the radio, talkies at the cinema, compact cassettes, videotapes, the internet, and MOOCs were all once predicted to transform higher level learning beyond all recognition. And of course, all these things have had their place in improving teaching and learning. But it always bemuses me when I go to education conferences and the audience is regaled with stories about the imminent transformation of teaching and learning. I try to absorb all that I'm being told, but a voice normally pops into my head to say, if the changes are so transformational, why are they being explained in such a traditional way? A PowerPoint slide or two, as here, is normally the limit. But perhaps artificial intelligence is different. After all, more than one Vice-Chancellor has written a book or two to say so. Perhaps we are truly, this time, on the cusp of something radically different. I must admit, I sometimes doubt it when I'm trying to get Alexa or Siri to do simple tasks. But perhaps in a few years' time, similar technology will have truly transformed all our lives. Yet I admit a doubt for a more fundamental reason too. In a decade's time, my younger child will still be young enough to have school homework. Artificial intelligence won't be able to do it for her if she is to benefit from the process of learning. Perhaps a machine, I'm told, will mark the work, giving instructors a better work-life balance or more time for other tasks. Yet I can't help feeling that part of the learning process is securing validation and approval from other human beings. If a student thinks their essays will only ever be evaluated by machines, why should they bother trying so hard to make them interesting? If we thought machines were the only things that were ever going to read happy publications, I know we'd put a lot less effort into them. Moreover, when we ask students how they want to learn, lectures surprisingly come top. Not because the learning in lectures is better, it isn't, but it's because people want to learn alongside others. And when asked what should replace lectures if they were to disappear, students don't say technological solutions, which come far behind other ways of learning from other humans, like small one-to-one groups. Later this week, we will publish, as Stephanie mentioned, a new paper by the Vice-Chancellor of the Open University, Tim Blackman, that gets under the skin of our student academic experience survey that, again, Stephanie mentioned and helped organise when she was at the Higher Education Academy. And Tim Blackman's new research will reveal a close link between the accessibility of academics and student well-being. So call me hopelessly naive, but I tend to think that when my children are 18, and they're still at primary school, if and when they want to go to university, their experience will still have quite a lot in common with mine 30 years ago. I want to end with some remarks on research. The UK invests much less national wealth than many other countries on research and development and continues to lag far behind the average for the OECD. However, in recent years, the main political parties have been committed to substantial increases in research. Sorry, one more. Thank you. The new government is certainly committed to a big increase in spending. This slide shows what they'd need to do to get to their targets. Boris Johnson promised to double government research and development spending to 18 billion in the next 5 years, and his election manifesto last year said we are committing to the fastest ever increase in domestic public R&D spending, including in basic science research, to meet our target of 2.4% of GDP being spent on R&D across the economy. Such increases represent a huge amount of money, but the commitments are relatively uncontroversial and enjoy support across the political spectrum. So in one sense, they should be relatively easy to deliver. Yet there are two challenges. First, we have been here before. Back in 2004, the then government's 10-year science and innovation framework set a target of increasing research and development investment as a proportion of national income to 2.5% by 2014. Yet over the period in question, the proportion of our national income spent on research and development did increase, but only from 1.5% to 1.6%, since when it has grown further, but only to 1.7%. It remains slightly lower than it was back in 1990, and much lower than it was at the start of the 1980s, when we were on 2%. In other words, willing a specific proportion of GDP to be spent on R&D, and even setting a precise target, is nothing like enough. Secondly, it's important to remember that the R&D target is a target for total spending. It's not just about public spending. So it assumes that any extra public spending will crowd in very substantial sums of private money, and that this will occur at a time of significant change, including in relation to our involvement with EU research funding arrangements. The quantum of funding, whether public or private, is far from the only cause of real uncertainty among the research community at the moment. Generally, when there's a government commitment to significantly increase spending, there is a sense of how the money will be spent. But I sometimes feel that there are more uncertainties than there are certainties in research spending at the moment. As we outlined in our election briefing document last year, we don't know what proportion of our future research budget will reach universities and how much will reach other organisations, such as non-university research institutes. We don't know much about the future landscape of research funding bodies, given the signals coming out of number 10 Downing Street about a new advanced research projects agency. We don't even know who's going to head up UK research and investment now that Mark Walport is standing down. We don't know how the commitments to fund excellence and the commitments to boost the regions will balance against one another or interact with one another. We don't know what proportion of the costs of any substantial research project will be covered by public grants in future. And although Brexit has now happened, we still don't know what our participation, if any, will be in EU-funded research, or what replacements there could be if we are not inside the tent. Despite the enshrining of the Haldane principle in primary legislation in 2017, which is designed to ensure research spending decisions are based on peer review, we also don't know the full extent of possible political interference in the distribution of research spending. And there's another point too. Previously, ministers made it clear that the 2.4% goal was designed to be hit within a decade. And just 3 years ago, the 2017 Conservative Manifesto additionally spoke of a longer-term goal of 3%. By continuing to focus on the 2.4% rather than the 3%, we are giving policymakers an excuse to be less ambitious, including at the forthcoming spending review. This makes it easier for them to set out shorter-term plans and to aim for the 2.4% OECD average rather than the more stellar performance of those who spend the most. In 2018, 7 countries already spent at least 3% of their GDP on research and development, including Germany, Sweden, Israel, and South Korea. So in my view, we should stop talking about the 2.4% and start talking about the 3%, as I try to argue in a blog that you can see on the slide up there. Thank you. I often say that over the past 5 years, there's been more change affecting UK higher education than in any other 5-year period since the start of higher education in the UK, before the UK was an entity, over 800 years ago. There have been major political changes in that last 5-year period, such as we've had a coalition government, minority government, 2 majority governments. We've had the referendum. We've now got Brexit itself. There have also been major changes that directly affect our sector above all, such as the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017, the replacement of the Higher Education and Funding Council for England with the Office for Students, and the establishment of the UK Research and Investment. Some people think this pace of change is likely to calm down now that we have a more stable government with a clear majority and a long mandate facing a weak opposition, currently weak opposition. But for the reasons I have outlined tonight, I find that unlikely. I only hope policymakers treat our sector with the same due care and attention, with due care and attention, for there are not many sectors of British life that are unquestionably world-class, but our university sector is one. And as I learned from Professor Peter Hennessy here all those years ago, Roy Jenkins once described Tony Blair's task in getting Labour back into power in 1997 as like a man carrying a priceless Ming vase across a highly polished floor. Stewarding our higher education sector in the years to come is likely to be a similarly challenging task. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you so much for that. I thought it was absolutely gripping the whole time. I have to say, as you were cantering through all the legislative changes as well, it was so interesting then to see your latter slides in terms of just look what the policy changes have been over the past 5 years. But I'm also minded of the fact that despite policy changes, it doesn't mean that practice necessarily keeps up with the policy changes. And I think that's the interesting dilemma for me. What happens when you have the resistors who, and I guess I'm looking at something like the access and participation plan, which I'm very proud of here, and I think we do a great job, but kind of that real change into that territory, the pace of change. What more evidence do you think that we should be doing to support universities that don't believe it necessarily is an issue for them?
Well, that's a good question. I think the Office for Students is putting a lot more pressure on than HEFCE did. It's got a different set of powers, of course. So, and I'm very struck, and I'm a university governor myself. I know there's, I always feel there's a connection between Manchester University, where I did my undergraduate degree, and here, where I did my postgraduate, not least because of Colin, the Vice-Chancellor, and indeed the previous Vice-Chancellor, both coming from Manchester. And I'm struck as a governor of the University of Manchester by the sort of conversations that governing bodies now have to have about access that didn't happen in the past. And one thing I'm interested in, I'm sure Queen Mary's a brilliantly governed institution, as is Manchester, but one thing I'm struck about is across the sector as a whole, I don't totally know if the quality of governance has yet to match the new regulatory world. And I think these sorts of conversations need now to happen at a governing body level, and they haven't always done so in the past.
Thanks, and that's probably a really good area for HEPI to be looking a bit more at in that whole governance space. Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. We've got about 8 minutes for questions, so who would like to ask a question? And I'm going to ask you to state your name and the part of the university you come from when you ask the question. Thank you. Just sorry, I think I'm in charge of the mic as well, so it's, obviously I need some.
Hello, my name is Maya, and I'm team manager within the careers service of Queen Mary. I'd like to ask you what your opinion is on higher degree apprenticeships and their position in that, their contribution to that increase, predicted increase of 300,000 or 50,000 students in higher education. What role do you think they would play?
Thank you, and thank you for letting me, giving me a gateway to plug a new report that we're going to have coming out quite soon, where we've surveyed heads of career services in universities and asked them how their role has changed as a result of things like graduate outcome survey, LEO data, and the extra focus the universities having to put on employment outcomes. So I hope it might help you in your fight for resources inside the institution. Degree apprenticeships, well, look, I think they're basically a great thing. I was talking to someone only earlier today, a big employer who I know is talking to Queen Mary about them and looking to work with you on expanding their apprenticeship programs. I think they're generally a great thing. I think for some people they are brilliant and much more attractive than your traditional form of higher education. I don't think they suit everybody. I'd also say there's been huge growth in them, but there still aren't as many of them as people think. You know, big percentage growth, but from very, very, very small numbers. And I also worry that I think the policy environment in the apprenticeship space has not settled down yet. There are lots and lots of people calling for very significant changes to the apprenticeship levy as part of the forthcoming budget. And so I worry that it's an area where it's very hard to plan. And I think that makes life hard for institutions, it makes life hard for careers advisors, makes life hard for potential apprenticeship people. And of course, there are a lot of people lobbying the government to say that the apprenticeship levy shouldn't be used for degree apprenticeships. If that were to happen, for example, that would really be very disruptive. So, I think it's watch this space.
And you're probably aware, Nick, of our degree apprenticeships in social justice that is taking place with our School of Business.
Yeah, I don't know as much about them as I should, but I do have this vague sense that you are more active in this space than many of your competitor institutions. Yeah.
Attracted a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Right. So, Darren, sorry, I'll canter up these steps as I'm in the cantering mode.
Thanks, Nick, for the great overview. Given a couple of the trends that you've pointed out and some that you've also published about but didn't mention today, so the increasing numbers of commuting students, the decreasing number of hours that students are spending on independent study, the relatively low number of classroom hours in many of at least the social sciences subjects, do you think the 24-week model cuts it to get students prepared for an advanced economy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So our big survey, our big student academic experience survey that we published, and we'll be doing it again in June, which Stephanie knows a huge amount about, has the best data on contact hours and workload, and that's what you're referring to. And we make that data available, so you can have that data, including the Queen Mary data. And I think the point of that survey was started when Tony Blair introduced 3,000 fees, because there was an assumption that contact hours and workload would go up as fees went up. And in fact, that hasn't really happened. I think students maybe use their time more efficiently, but they, on average, work about 30 hours a week, whereas the quality assurance agencies say students should work about 40 hours a week. So there's huge differences by discipline. But your question about the sort of 24-week model, I mean, I am a governor of two universities. I'm also governor of my local university, which is the University of Buckingham, which their argument would be, no, the 24-week model is wrong. All their degrees are 2-year degrees. They squeeze 4-term years. They squeeze similar amounts of learning down into 2 years, just far less vacation time. And it's very, very attractive to a lot of people, but it's not attractive to everybody because, of course, people love their time at university. They want to be at university for a long time. I often think of the person who put in Who's Who under education. They put their education was in their holidays from school and university. You know, if you make good use of your of the other 24 weeks of the year, more than 24 weeks. But I tell you what I would like to see. I think, frankly, it's outrageous that a tiny organisation like mine, 4 people, working with Stephanie's old colleagues, have the best contact hours data in the whole sector. Why isn't it in the National Student Survey? Why isn't this data officially collected? Why isn't it available to students before they apply? Contact hours are a very poor measure of the quality of learning, but I think it's still a measure people have a right to know. Independent hours are maybe a better measure of the quality of learning. I think it's an area where we still need much more transparency. And I'd be interested to know how you would have answered your own question, because but maybe we can chat afterwards about that.
Yes, I'm just thinking actually on your diagram of all the different changes, we did actually have the KISS at one stage that wasn't in there, the key information set, that recorded exactly that, but then it was scrapped because it was suggested nobody used it. But anyway, there we go. A lot of food for thought, and I'm sure it'll stimulate a lot more debate in the days to come. So, Nick, can I thank you so much for a wonderful lecture this evening.
Thank you.